It was a bright, sunny morning on Jake's little farm. The sky was blue, with fluffy white clouds floating high above. The sun peeked over the trees, shining warm light on everything below. Jake's farm wasn't big, but it was his. He had a small red barn with a pointy roof, a wooden fence that wobbled a little, and a patch of green grass where his animals played. His chickens clucked and strutted around, flapping their wings like they were saying hello. His goats, two of them, named Daisy and Max, munched on grass, chewing slowly with their funny little mouths. Daisy had a white coat with black spots, and Max was all brown with a scruffy beard. They were noisy sometimes, but Jake didn't mind. The air smelled fresh, like hay and flowers mixed together. It was a happy place, and Jake loved it. Jake was a tall guy with messy brown hair and a big smile. He wore a red shirt and old jeans that had dirt on them from working outside. Every morning, he'd grab a bucket of feed and walk out to see his animals. "Good morning, buddies," he'd say, tossing corn to the chickens. They'd peck at it fast, their little heads bobbing up and down. Then he'd pat Daisy and Max on the head, laughing when Max tried to nibble his shirt. To Jake, these animals weren't just pets, they were his family. He didn't have a mom or dad around anymore, and his brother lived far away. So, the chickens and goats kept him company. They made him feel like he wasn't alone. But not everyone liked Jake's farm. Nope, not at all. Across the street, behind a big window with fancy curtains, someone was watching. Her name was Karen, and she wasn't happy. Karen lived in a perfect white house with a perfect green lawn. Everything about her house was neat, too neat, like a picture in a magazine. She had short blonde hair that didn't move, even in the wind, and she always wore a frown. Karen was the boss of the neighborhood HOA. That's a group of people who make rules for everyone to follow, like no loud music or messy yards. Karen loved rules. She loved them so much she carried a clipboard everywhere, writing down things she didn't like. And right now, she didn't like Jake's farm one bit. Karen stood at her window, her eyes squinting at the chickens. "Too noisy," she muttered to herself. She tapped her pen on her clipboard, making little clicking sounds. Then she looked at the goats. "Too smelly," she grumbled. She wrote that down too. Karen had a plan, a mean one. She wanted Jake's animals gone. She didn't care that they made him happy. To her, they were trouble, and she was going to ruin Jake's day. Maybe even his whole week. She turned away from the window, her frown growing bigger, and grabbed her phone. Oh boy, things were about to get wild. Hey, you watching from somewhere cool today? Tell me in the comments where you're at. I bet you're wondering what's going to happen next, right? Well, stick around, because this story is just getting started. Jake didn't know it yet, but Karen was about to stir up trouble. Big, messy, loud trouble. And here's the best part, she had no idea what was coming her way. None at all. Sound juicy yet? Good, because I've got more to tell you. Let's go back to Jake for a second. He was still outside, enjoying his morning. The chickens were running in circles, chasing each other like it was a game. Daisy the goat stood still, munching grass, while Max hopped around, kicking his little legs in the air. Jake laughed. "You're a silly one, Max," he said. He sat on an old wooden stool by the barn, watching his animals play. The sun felt warm on his face, and a soft breeze blew through the trees. It was peaceful. Perfect. Jake didn't have a fancy house like Karen's, but he didn't need one. His farm was small, but it was home. Across the street, though, Karen was anything but peaceful. She paced back and forth in her living room, her shoes clicking on the shiny floor. Her clipboard was full of notes now, all about Jake. Chickens too loud, she'd written. Goats too messy. Farm looks bad. She even drew a little angry face next to Jake's name. Karen didn't like anything that wasn't perfect, and Jake's farm? It was far from perfect in her eyes. She stopped pacing and looked out the window again. Jake was still there, smiling at his animals. That made Karen madder. "Who does he think he is?" she said out loud. "This neighborhood has rules." Karen wasn't just any neighbor. Oh no. She was the queen of the HOA. Everyone knew her. If you parked your car in the wrong spot, Karen would knock on your door. If your grass grew too tall, she'd leave a note. One time, she yelled at a kid for riding a scooter too fast. "Slow down, she shouted, waving her clipboard like a weapon. The kid just stared, then zoomed away. Karen didn't like losing, though. She always found a way to win, or so she thought. Today, she was sure she'd win against Jake. She'd make him get rid of those animals, and she'd smile while doing it. Jake, on the other hand, didn't even know Karen was watching. He was too busy enjoying his day. He grabbed a broom and started sweeping the dirt by the barn. The chickens followed him, pecking at the ground. "You guys are funny," he said, shaking his head. He didn't hear Karen muttering across the street. He didn't see her writing more notes. All he cared about was his little farm and the happy noises his animals made. But that was about to change. Trouble was coming, and it had Karen's name all over it. Let's talk about Karen's house for a minute. It was fancy, like I said. The windows sparkled, the grass was cut just right, and the mailbox had her name in big gold letters, Karen Miller. She loved showing off. Every morning, she'd walk outside in her perfect outfit, usually a blue dress and white shoes, and check her yard. If one leaf was out of place, she'd pick it up. If a bird sang too loud, she'd glare at it. Karen wanted everything quiet, clean, and boring. That's why Jake's farm drove her crazy. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't clean. And it definitely wasn't boring. Jake's farm was the opposite. The barn had chipped paint, red flakes peeling off the sides. The fence leaned a little, like it might fall over in a big wind. The grass wasn't neat, it was patchy, with clumps of dirt here and there. But Jake didn't care. To him, it was perfect. The chickens added life with their clucks and flutters. The goats made it fun with their goofy jumps. Every day felt like an adventure. He'd wake up, feed the animals, and sit outside with a glass of water, watching the world go by. Simple. Happy. Free. Karen hated that freedom. She liked control. She liked telling people what to do. And Jake? He wasn't following her rules. The HOA had a big book of them: no loud noises, no messy yards, no animals that weren't cats or dogs. Karen carried that book everywhere, like it was her best friend. She'd point to page 12, rule number 7, no farm animals allowed. Jake's chickens and goats broke that rule, and Karen was ready to fight. She didn't know Jake very well, though. He wasn't the type to give up easy. And he had a surprise up his sleeve, one Karen wouldn't see coming. Back at the farm, Jake finished sweeping. He leaned the broom against the barn and stretched his arms. The sun was higher now, warming up the day. Daisy the goat walked over and nudged his leg. "Hungry again?" Jake asked, laughing. He grabbed some hay from a pile and tossed it to her. Max ran over too, bleating like he didn't want to miss out. The chickens joined in, pecking at the ground nearby. It was a noisy, happy mess, and Jake loved every second of it. He didn't hear Karen's phone call across the street. He didn't see her smirk as she dialed a number. He was too busy living his life. Karen, though, was ready to pounce. She held the phone to her ear, waiting for someone to answer. "Hello, HOA office," she said when a voice picked up. "I've got a problem. A big one." She explained everything: Jake's chickens, his goats, his messy farm. "It's ruining the neighborhood," she snapped. The person on the phone sighed. "We'll look into it, Karen," they said. But that wasn't enough for her. She hung up and dialed another number. This time, it was 911. "Yep, the police. I need help," she told the operator. "There's a man with loud animals breaking all the rules." The operator asked questions, but Karen didn't care. She wanted action. "Send someone now," she demanded. Then she hung up and smiled. She thought she'd won already. She thought Jake would be scared when the cops showed up. Oh, how wrong she was. See, Jake wasn't just a farmer with chickens and goats. He had something else, something secret. And Karen? She was about to step right into a trap she didn't even know existed. Let's zoom out for a second. Picture this: Jake's little farm on one side of the street, full of life and noise. Karen's perfect house on the other, quiet and stiff. Two different worlds, right next to each other. Jake didn't bother anyone. He kept to himself, feeding his animals and fixing his fence. But Karen couldn't leave him alone. She saw his farm as a problem, a big, loud, smelly problem. And she was sure she could fix it. She'd fixed things before, after all. Like when she made Mr. Thompson take down his basketball hoop. Or when she got Mrs. Lee to repaint her mailbox because it was too colorful. Karen always won. Always. Except this time, she wouldn't. Jake didn't know it yet, but he was about to turn the tables. Karen thought she was smart, calling the HOA and the cops. She thought she had all the power. But power isn't just about rules or clipboards. Sometimes, it's about staying calm and knowing more than everyone else. Jake knew something Karen didn't. And that something was going to change everything. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Jake's chickens kept clucking, his goats kept munching, and the day rolled on. Across the street, Karen put her phone down and grabbed her clipboard again. She wrote one more note: police called. Problem solved. She underlined it twice, her pen digging into the paper. She was so sure of herself. So sure she'd get rid of Jake's animals and make everything perfect again. She didn't see the police car that drove by slowly, its windows dark. She didn't notice how it paused near her house, not Jake's. She was too busy planning her victory. Jake, meanwhile, sat back on his stool. He took a sip of water and watched Max chase a butterfly. "You're a wild one," he said with a chuckle. The butterfly flew away, and Max bleated like he was mad. Jake shook his head, still smiling. He had no idea Karen had called 911. He didn't know she was plotting against him. All he knew was that his farm was his happy place, and he'd fight to keep it that way. But he wouldn't have to fight alone. Nope. Help was already on the way, help Karen didn't expect. "Hey, you still with me? This story's about to get crazy. Where are you watching from today? Tell me in the comments, I love hearing from you." Jake's day seemed normal so far, right? Just a guy and his animals, enjoying the sun. But Karen was stirring up trouble, big trouble. And here's the kicker, she had no clue what was coming back at her. None at all. It's like she lit a match and didn't see the fireworks waiting to explode. Sound exciting? Oh, it is. Stick around, because this is only the beginning. Let's set the scene one more time. Jake's farm was alive with noise, clucks, bleats, and the rustle of hay. The barn stood proud, even with its chipped paint. The fence wobbled, but it held strong. The chickens ran free, and the goats played like kids on a playground. Across the street, Karen's house was silent. Too silent. Her lawn was flat, her windows were clean, and her clipboard was ready. Two people, two lives, about to crash into each other. Jake didn't want a fight. Karen did. But who would win? That's the question, isn't it? Karen thought she had it all figured out. She thought her rules and her phone calls would scare Jake into giving up. She thought she was the queen, and he was just a nobody with some animals. But queens can fall. And nobodies? Sometimes they're more than they seem. Jake wasn't just a farmer. He wasn't just a guy with goats. He had a secret, a big one. And Karen was about to find out the hard way. The day was still young. The sun shone bright, the breeze blew soft, and Jake's farm hummed with life. Karen's house stayed quiet, but her mind was loud. She was planning, plotting, waiting. She thought she'd ruin Jake's day. She thought she'd win. But trouble doesn't always go the way you expect. Sometimes, it turns around and bites you instead. And that's exactly what was coming for Karen. She just didn't know it yet. So, there you go, the start of our story. Jake's happy little farm, Karen's mean little plan, and a whole lot of surprises waiting to pop. What do you think happens next? Can you guess Jake's secret? Don't go anywhere, because this tale is about to get wilder than a goat on a trampoline. Stick with me, friends, we've got a long, fun ride ahead. The sun was still shining high over Jake's little farm. His chickens clucked and pecked at the ground, and his goats, Daisy and Max, chewed on some grass near the fence. Everything felt calm and happy. But then, across the street, trouble started walking toward him. Karen strutted over to Jake's fence like she owned the whole world. Her nose was wrinkled up, like she smelled something stinky, even though the air was fresh with hay and flowers. She stopped right at the edge of Jake's yard, her hands on her hips, and stared at him with mean eyes. "Those chickens are too loud," she barked, her voice sharp and loud. She pointed at the little birds as they flapped around. And those goats, she added, glaring at Daisy and Max. They're against the rules. I'm calling the HOA and the cops if I have to. Her words came out fast, like she couldn't wait to yell them. She wanted Jake to feel scared. She wanted him to know she was in charge. Karen's blonde hair didn't move at all, even though a little breeze was blowing. She looked stiff and angry, like a statue that could shout. Jake didn't jump or frown. Nope. He just smiled a small, easy smile and tipped his old brown hat at her. They're my pets, ma'am, he said calmly. His voice was soft, like he was talking to a friend, not someone yelling at him. He didn't sound mad or worried. He just stood there, holding a bucket of feed, looking at Karen like she was a buzzing fly he could ignore. Then he turned back to his animals, tossing some corn to the chickens. They ran over, pecking at it with their tiny beaks, while Daisy and Max kept munching grass like nothing was happening. Karen didn't like that. Not one bit. She wanted Jake to argue or beg or say sorry. But he didn't. He just kept smiling and feeding his pets. That made her madder. Her face turned pink, and her eyes got small and squinted. You can't have animals like that here, she snapped again, waving her hand at the farm. This is a nice neighborhood, not a zoo. She stomped her foot on the ground, her white shoe making a little thud. Then she spun around and marched back to her perfect white house, already pulling her phone out of her pocket. She was dialing someone, and she wasn't going to stop until Jake's animals were gone. Jake watched her go, still humming a little tune. It was a happy song, one he made up while working outside. He wasn't worried. Not even a little. He tossed more feed to the chickens and patted Max on the head. She's loud, huh, buddy, he said to the goat, chuckling. Max bleated back, like he was agreeing. Jake didn't care that Karen was mad. He didn't care that she was calling the HOA or maybe even the police. He loved his farm, and he wasn't going to let her ruin his day. But here's the thing, Karen thought she was the boss of everyone, and Jake? He wasn't just some guy with chickens. He had a secret, a big, sneaky secret, and it was about to turn Karen's world upside down. Can you guess what it might be? Keep watching, because this is getting good. Let's talk about Karen for a minute. She wasn't just any neighbor. Oh no. She was the queen of the neighborhood HOA. That's a group that makes rules for everyone to follow, like no loud music, no tall grass, and definitely no farm animals. Karen loved being in charge. She'd walk around with her clipboard, writing down anything she didn't like. If kids rode their bikes too fast, she'd yell at them. Slow down, or I'll tell your parents, she'd shout, shaking her pen. If someone planted flowers that were too bright, she'd leave a note saying, change these now. She even told old Mr. Thompson to take down his basketball hoop because it looked messy. Everyone listened to her, even if they didn't want to. Karen always got her way. But Jake was different. He didn't bow down to her. He didn't say, yes, ma'am, and run away. He just smiled and kept doing what he loved, taking care of his animals. That drove Karen crazy. She wasn't used to people ignoring her. She wasn't used to losing. So, when she saw Jake's chickens clucking and his goats hopping around, she decided he had to go. Not Jake himself, but his animals. She wanted his farm quiet and boring, just like her house. And she was ready to fight to make it happen. Back at her house, Karen slammed the door shut. Bang. The sound echoed across the street, but Jake didn't even look up. He was too busy watching Daisy chase a butterfly. Karen stood in her perfect living room, her phone in one hand and her clipboard in the other. She started pacing back and forth, back and forth. Her shoes clicked on the shiny floor, loud and fast. I'll fix this, she muttered to herself. I'll call the HOA first. They'll back me up. And if that doesn't work, the cops will. She nodded, like she was agreeing with herself, and started dialing. Jake didn't hear her muttering. He didn't know she was making a plan. He was still outside, humming his tune, tossing feed to his animals. The chickens ran around in little circles, their feathers puffing up. Max the goat jumped onto an old tire Jake kept by the barn, standing there like he was king of the farm. Look at you. Jake laughed, clapping his hands. Daisy bleated and joined Max, nudging him with her head. They tumbled off the tire together, rolling in the grass. Jake shook his head, still smiling. "You two are silly," he said. He loved how happy they were. He loved how they made noise and messes. To him, that was what a home should be, alive and fun. Karen didn't think so. Nope. To her, a home should be quiet and perfect. She hated noise. She hated messes. And she really, really hated Jake's farm. She finished dialing the HOA number and held the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said when someone answered. "This is Karen Miller, HOA president. We've got a problem. A big one." She told them all about Jake, his loud chickens, his smelly goats, his messy yard. "It's against the rules," she said, her voice getting louder. Page 12, rule number 7: no farm animals. "He's breaking it, and I want him stopped." The person on the phone sighed. "Okay, Karen," they said. "We'll look into it." But that wasn't fast enough for her. She hung up and frowned. "They're too slow," she grumbled. She tapped her pen on her clipboard, thinking hard. Then her eyes lit up. "The police," she said out loud. "They'll fix this right away." She dialed 911 next, her fingers moving fast. "Hello, police," she said when they answered. "I need help. There's a man with animals breaking all the rules. Send someone now." Jake didn't know about her calls. He didn't hear her yelling into the phone. He was too busy sitting on his old stool by the barn, watching his animals play. The sun was warm on his face, and the breeze felt nice. He took a sip of water from a glass he'd brought outside and leaned back, relaxing. "What a good day," he said to himself. The chickens clucked, the goats bleated, and everything felt right. But Karen was out there, stirring up trouble. She thought she could scare Jake. She thought she could win. She didn't know he wasn't scared at all. And she definitely didn't know about his secret. Let's go back to that fence moment for a second. When Karen yelled at Jake, he didn't yell back. He didn't even look mad. He just smiled and said, "They're my pets, ma'am." That was it. 3 little words. But those words made Karen so angry she couldn't stand it. She wasn't used to people staying calm when she shouted. Most people got nervous or argued back. Not Jake. He acted like she was no big deal, like her words didn't matter. And that made her want to fight even harder. Karen was the kind of person who liked to push people around. She'd been doing it for years. Like the time she made Mrs. Lee repaint her mailbox. It was yellow, and Karen said it was too loud. Mrs. Lee didn't want to change it, but Karen kept knocking on her door until she did. Or the time she told Mr. Thompson his basketball hoop was ugly. He took it down after Karen left notes every day for a week. She always won because people got tired of fighting her. But Jake wasn't tired. He wasn't even starting to fight. He just kept living his life, and that was a problem for Karen. Across the street, Karen finished her 911 call and smiled. It was a mean smile, like a cat that caught a mouse. "They're coming," she said to herself. "They'll tell him to get rid of those animals, and I'll watch him cry." She walked to her window and peeked out, her curtains pulled back just a little. She saw Jake sitting there, still feeding his chickens, still humming. "He thinks he's so smart," she muttered. "He won't be smiling soon." She tapped her clipboard again, feeling proud. She thought she had everything under control. She thought she was the boss. But Jake wasn't just some guy with chickens. Nope. He had something up his sleeve, something Karen didn't see coming. He wasn't worried because he knew things she didn't. While she was yelling and calling people, he was calm and steady. Why? Because he had a secret. A big one. And it wasn't just about his animals. It was something that could flip this whole story upside down. Can you guess what it might be? Don't go anywhere, because it's going to get wild. Let's picture the scene again. Jake's farm was alive with noise and movement. The chickens ran around, their little feet kicking up dirt. Daisy and Max hopped near the fence, playing like they didn't have a care in the world. The barn stood tall, its red paint chipped but strong. The grass wasn't neat, but it was green and soft. Jake sat there, humming, smiling, happy. Across the street, Karen's house was quiet. Too quiet. Her lawn was flat, her windows sparkled, and her clipboard was ready. She was plodding, pacing, waiting for her victory. Karen thought she was winning already. She thought her phone calls would fix everything. She thought Jake would give up when the HOA and the cops showed up. But Jake didn't look like a guy who gave up. He looked like a guy who knew something big. And that's what made this so exciting. Karen was loud and pushy, but Jake was calm and quiet. Who would win? The loud queen of the HOA or the quiet farmer with a secret? That's the question, isn't it? The day kept going. The sun moved higher, the breeze blew stronger, and Jake's animals kept playing. Karen stayed inside, watching from her window, waiting for someone to show up. She was sure the HOA would call back soon. She was sure the police would roll in with sirens and lights. She could almost see Jake looking sad, packing up his chickens and goats, leaving his farm empty. That's what she wanted. That's what she dreamed of. But dreams don't always come true, do they? Jake finished feeding the animals and stood up. He stretched his arms and looked around. "You're the best, guys," he said to his chickens and goats. They didn't answer, of course they just kept clucking and bleating, but Jake smiled anyway. He didn't know Karen was watching. He didn't know she'd called 911. He didn't know she was ready to fight him with everything she had. All he knew was that his farm was his home, and he'd do anything to keep it safe. Anything. Karen, though, was ready for war. She grabbed her clipboard and wrote more notes. "Called HOA," she scribbled. "Called police. Jake will lose." She underlined "lose" 3 times, her pen digging into the paper. She was so sure of herself. So sure she'd get rid of those animals and make Jake sorry he ever moved here. She didn't see the little police car that drove by earlier. She didn't notice how it slowed down near her house, not Jake's. She was too busy planning her big win. But Jake wasn't worried. Not even a little. He hummed his tune, patted Daisy on the head, and watched Max chase another butterfly. He didn't know what Karen was up to, but he didn't need to. He had his animals, his farm, and his secret. And that secret? It was going to change everything. Karen thought she was the boss of everyone, but she was about to learn something new. Something shocking. Something that would make her wish she'd never messed with Jake. So, there's the tension building up. Karen's yelling and calling people, Jake's staying calm and happy, and something big is hiding just out of sight. What do you think Jake's secret is? Can you feel the trouble coming? Keep watching, because this story is about to get even crazier. Karen's world is going to flip, and Jake's going to smile through it all. Stick around, friends, this is only the start. Jake stood by his barn, watching Max the goat chase that butterfly. The little bug zipped through the air, its wings flashing in the sun, and Max leaped after it, his hooves kicking up dirt. Jake laughed, a big, happy sound that carried over the farm. "You're never gonna catch it, buddy," he said, shaking his head. Daisy the goat watched too, her head tilted like she was confused. The chickens clucked and pecked nearby, their feathers ruffling in the breeze. It was a perfect moment, sunny, noisy, and full of life. Jake didn't have a clue that Karen was across the street, plotting against him. He didn't know she'd called the HOA and 911. He was just enjoying his day, humming that little tune he loved. Across the street, Karen was a storm waiting to break. She stood at her window, her phone still warm from all the calls she'd made. She peeked through the curtains, her eyes locked on Jake. He was smiling, and that made her so mad she could hardly stand it. "He thinks he's safe," she muttered, her voice low and grumpy. "He thinks those stupid animals can stay. Well, he's wrong." She tapped her clipboard with her pen, the click 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 filling her quiet house. She'd called the HOA, and they'd said they'd look into it. She'd called the police, and they'd said they'd send someone. Now, all she had to do was wait. And Karen hated waiting. She paced again, her shoes clicking louder on the floor. Back and forth, like a clock ticking. "They'll come soon," she told herself. "The HOA will write him a big fat fine. The cops will tell him to get rid of those chickens and goats. And then I'll win." She stopped pacing and smiled that mean smile again. She could picture it so clearly, Jake packing up his animals, his head hanging low, his farm empty and quiet. That's what she wanted. That's what she needed. She didn't care that Jake loved his pets. She didn't care that they made him happy. To her, they were loud and messy, and that was all that mattered. Jake, though, Wasn't thinking about losing. Nope. He wasn't thinking about Karen at all. He grabbed a handful of hay and tossed it to Daisy. "Here you go, girl," he said. She munched it happily, her little tail wagging. Max gave up on the butterfly and ran over, nudging Jake's leg for some hay too. All right," Jake said, laughing again. He gave Max a big pile, and the goat started chewing like it was the best snack ever. The chickens crowded around, pecking at the ground for any crumbs. Jake sat back on his stool, his hands resting on his knees. "You guys are the best," he said, his voice soft and warm. Karen didn't hear that. She couldn't. She was too busy glaring out her window, her fingers tied around her clipboard. "Look at him," she grumbled. "Acting like nothing's wrong." "Well, something's wrong, all right. He's breaking the rules." She flipped open her HOA rulebook. It was thick, with tiny words on every page, and pointed to rule number 7. "No farm animals allowed," she read out loud. "See? It's right here. He can't have chickens. He can't have goats. This isn't a farm, it's a neighborhood." She slammed the book shut, the bang echoing in her perfect, quiet house. She thought about the day Jake moved in. It was a few months ago, and Karen had watched from the same window. He'd pulled up in an old truck, its sides scratched and rusty. The chickens were in a crate in the back, clucking like crazy. The goats were tied up with rope, bleating and hopping as Jake led them out. Karen's nose had wrinkled then too. "Who is this guy?" she'd said to herself. "What's he doing here?" She didn't like him from the start. His farm wasn't neat like her house. His animals weren't quiet like her yard. He didn't fit, and Karen didn't like things that didn't fit. Back then, she'd tried to be nice, at least, her version of nice. She'd walked over with her clipboard and said, "You can't have those animals here. There are rules." Jake had just smiled, that same calm smile, and said, "They're my pets, ma'am. They're staying." Karen had blinked, surprised. Most people didn't talk back to her. Most people said, "Oh, okay," and did what she wanted. But not Jake. He'd tipped his hat and gone back to unloading his truck. That's when Karen decided she didn't like him. And now, months later, she was ready to get rid of him, or at least his animals. Jake didn't know about her hate. He didn't know she'd been watching him since day one. He was too busy living his life. Right now, he stood up from his stool and stretched his arms high. The sun was hot now, and sweat dotted his forehead. He wiped it off with his sleeve and looked around. The farm was small, but it was his. The barn needed paint, the fence wobbled, and the grass was patchy. But to Jake, it was home. The chickens clucked like they were singing, and the goats played like they were kids. "Can't ask for more than this," he said to himself, nodding. Karen, though, wanted more. She wanted silence. She wanted order. She wanted Jake gone, or at least his animals. She looked out her window again and saw him standing there, looking happy. "Not for long," she said, her voice sharp. She wrote one more note on her clipboard, "Police coming soon." She underlined it, her pen scratching hard. She was sure they'd show up any minute. She was sure they'd back her up. She'd told them Jake was breaking the rules, and that was enough, right? She didn't know Jake wasn't worried. She didn't know he had a secret. Let's talk about that secret for a second. Jake wasn't just some guy with chickens and goats. Nope. There was more to him, something Karen couldn't see. He didn't act scared when she yelled. He didn't run when she threatened to call the cops. Why? Because he knew something she didn't. Something big. Something that could make her plan fall apart like a house of cards in the wind. Can you guess what it might be? Maybe he knew the rules better than she did. Maybe he had friends who could help. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something even wilder. Keep watching, because it's coming. Karen didn't think about secrets. She didn't think Jake could fight back. She thought he was weak, just a quiet farmer with no power. She was wrong, but she didn't know it yet. Right now, she was too busy waiting. She sat on her perfect white couch, her phone on the table, her clipboard in her lap. She kept looking at the clock tick, tick, tick. "Where are they?" she muttered. "The police should be here by now." She stood up and paced again, her shoes clicking faster. She was getting antsy. She wanted action. She wanted to see Jake lose. Outside, Jake grabbed a broom and started sweeping the dirt by the barn. The chickens followed him, pecking at the ground like it was a game. "You guys are silly," he said, grinning. He didn't hear Karen's muttering. He didn't see her pacing. He didn't know she was waiting for the cops to roll in. He just kept sweeping, humming his tune, enjoying the day. The sun shone bright, the breeze blew soft, and his animals stayed close. It was peaceful. Happy. Perfect. But Karen wasn't happy. Nope. She was madder every minute. She checked her phone. No calls back yet. She looked out the window again. Jake was still there, sweeping like nothing was wrong. "He's so annoying," she said, stomping her foot. She hated how calm he was. She hated how he didn't care about her rules. She hated everything about him. "Just wait," she said to herself. "The police will fix this. They'll make him sorry." She didn't know the police weren't coming for Jake. She didn't know they'd already driven by twice, and slowed down near her house, not his. She didn't see it because she was too busy being mad. Jake didn't see it either, but he wouldn't have cared. He wasn't scared of Karen or her calls. He had his farm, his animals, and his secret. And that secret was like a shield, something she couldn't break through, no matter how loud she yelled. Let's zoom out again. Picture this, Jake's farm on one side of the street, full of noise and life. The chickens clucked, the goats jumped, and Jake hummed. Across the street, Karen's house sat quiet and stiff. Her lawn was flat, her windows clean, her clipboard ready. Two worlds, so close but so different. Karen wanted to crush Jake's world. She wanted to make it like hers, silent and boring. She thought she could do it with her rules and her phone calls. She thought she was the boss of everyone. But Jake wasn't everyone. He didn't bow to her. He didn't shake when she shouted. He just smiled and kept going. Why? Because he wasn't worried. He wasn't scared. He had something Karen didn't, a secret that could turn everything around. She thought she was winning, but she wasn't. She thought she was strong, but Jake was stronger. Not with loud words or mean looks, but with something quiet and sneaky. Something she'd never guess. The day rolled on. The sun climbed higher, the shadows got shorter, and Jake kept working. He swept the dirt, fed the animals, and sat back down on his stool. He took another sip of water and watched Max chase a new butterfly. "You never learn, do you?" he said, laughing. Daisy bleated like she was laughing too. The chickens strutted around, proud and noisy. It was a good day, a great day. Jake didn't know trouble was brewing. He didn't know Karen was waiting for the cops. He didn't need to know. He was happy, and that was enough. Karen, though, wasn't happy. She was impatient. She kept pacing, her shoes clicking, her clipboard bouncing in her hand. Come on," she said, checking her phone again. She wanted the police to show up. She wanted the HOA to call back. She wanted Jake to lose, right now. She didn't like waiting. She didn't like losing control. And right now, she felt like she was losing it. Jake was too calm. Too happy. Too free. She couldn't stand it. She looked out her window one more time. Jake was sitting there, sipping his water, smiling at his animals. "Enjoy it while it lasts," she muttered. She was sure her plan would work. She was sure the cops would come for him. She was sure she'd win. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know Jake's secret. She didn't know the trouble wasn't coming for him, it was coming for her. And when it hit hard. So, the tension's growing, right? Karen's mad and pushy, Jake's calm and cool, and something big is hiding just out of sight. Can you feel it building? Can you guess what Jake knows that Karen doesn't? This story's heating up, and it's about to get wild. Stick around, friends, there's so much more to come. Days went by after Karen yelled at Jake by his fence. The sun came up every morning, bright and warm, shining over Jake's little farm. His chickens kept clucking, his goats kept munching grass, and life went on. But Karen? She didn't let things stay quiet. Nope. She got louder, way louder. One sunny afternoon, she marched right up to Jake's front door, her shoes stomping on the ground. She carried her big HOA rulebook in one hand, waving it like a flag. Bang, bang, bang. She hit the door hard with her fist, her face red and angry. Jake opened the door slow and easy, peeking out. Karen didn't wait for him to say hi. "You're breaking every law in here," she shouted, shaking the rulebook in his face. Her voice was so loud the chickens in the yard stopped clucking for a second. "No farm animals. No loud noises. No messy yards. It's all right here, and you're ruining everything." She flipped the book open, pointing at the pages with her finger. "See? Page 12, rule number 7. You can't have those chickens or those goats. Get rid of them now." Jake didn't say much. He just stood there, looking at her with his calm eyes. He didn't yell back. He didn't argue. He just nodded a little, like he was listening but not really worried. "Okay, ma'am," he said softly, his voice steady. Then he closed the door nice and slow right in Karen's face. She stood there, her mouth open, shocked. No one ever shut the door on her. She banged on it again, harder this time. "You can't ignore me," she yelled. "I'm the HOA president. You have to listen." But Jake didn't open it again. He walked back to his kitchen, humming his little tune, like nothing happened. Karen huffed and stomped off his porch, her shoes making loud thuds. She was so mad she could barely think straight. "He thinks he's so smart," she muttered to herself, clutching her rulebook tight. "Well, I'll show him. He can't win this." She marched back to her perfect white house across the street, her mind racing with plans. Jake wasn't scared, and that made her even angrier. She wanted him to shake. She wanted him to beg. But he didn't, and that drove her nuts. Inside his house, Jake sat down with a glass of water. He took a sip and looked out his window. The chickens were back to clucking, and Daisy and Max the goats were playing by the barn. Everything seemed normal, happy, even. But then Jake noticed something odd. A police car rolled by his street, its black and white sides shining in the sun. It moved slow, real slow, like it was looking for something. Jake tilted his head. "Huh," he said to himself. "That's weird." He watched it go by, then shrugged and took another sip of water. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a cop driving around. But then, a little while later, it happened again. The same police car rolled by twice in one day. Weird, right? Jake scratched his head, his fingers brushing his messy brown hair. What's going on, he wondered out loud. He didn't think it was about him. He hadn't done anything wrong. His animals weren't hurting anyone. So why were the police driving by? He stood up and walked to his porch, peeking out at the street. The car was gone now, but it left him curious. Something felt funny, like a puzzle he couldn't figure out yet. He didn't know Karen was behind it. He didn't know she was stirring up trouble. But he was starting to wonder. Across the street, Karen didn't see the police car. Nope. She was too busy being loud and bossy. She stood in her perfect living room, her phone pressed to her ear. She'd called 911 again, yep, the police, because she wasn't done fighting. "Hello," she said, her voice whiny and sharp. "It's me again. That man with the smelly farm animals is ruining my peace. His chickens are so loud I can't sleep. His goats stink up the whole street. You have to do something." She paced back and forth, her shoes clicking on the floor, her free hand waving in the air. The operator on the phone sighed a big, tired sigh. "Ma'am, we'll send someone out," they said, sounding bored. Karen didn't care if they were tired. She just wanted action. "Good," she snapped. "Make it fast. He's breaking all the rules, and I'm sick of it." She hung up and smirked, her lips curling into a mean little smile. "Got him now," she said to herself. She tossed her phone onto her perfect white couch and crossed her arms. She thought she'd won. She thought the police would show up, yell at Jake, and make him get rid of his animals. She could almost see it, Jake sad, his farm empty, her neighborhood quiet again. Oh, how happy that made her. But Karen didn't know everything. Not even close. While she was smirking and pacing, Jake stepped outside again. He walked to his fence, his boots crunching on the gravel. The chickens followed him, clucking and flapping their wings. Daisy and Max trotted over too, bleating like they wanted to say hi. Jake smiled at them, but his eyes drifted to the street. And there it was, the police car again. This time, it wasn't just rolling by. It was parked, just down the road, near a big oak tree. Jake scratched his head again. Why are they already here, he wondered. His eyebrows went up, and he leaned against the fence, watching. The car sat there, quiet and still. No lights flashing, no sirens blaring, just parked. Jake couldn't see inside, the windows were too dark. But it made him think. Why would a police car be here, not once, not twice, but 3 times? He hadn't called them. His animals weren't causing trouble. So what was going on? He didn't have the answer yet, but he felt it, something big was brewing. Something sneaky. Something Karen didn't see coming. What do you think it was? Don't go anywhere, this is getting good. Let's go back to Karen for a minute. She was still in her house, feeling proud of herself. She grabbed her clipboard and wrote a new note, called 911 again. Police coming. Jake's done. She underlined done twice, her pen digging into the paper. She loved writing notes. It made her feel strong, like she was in charge of everything. She walked to her window and peeked out, expecting to see Jake looking scared. But he wasn't. He was by his fence, calm as ever, watching his animals play. That made her mad all over again. Why isn't he worried, she muttered. He should be packing up right now. Karen didn't know about the police car. She didn't see it parked down the road. She was too busy thinking about her victory. She paced some more, her shoes clicking faster. They'll be here soon, she said to herself. They'll tell him to get rid of those animals, and I'll watch from right here. She tapped her clipboard on the windowsill, her smirk growing. She thought she had Jake cornered. She thought he couldn't fight back. But Jake wasn't cornered. He wasn't even fighting yet. He was just watching, waiting, noticing things Karen missed. Days kept passing, and Karen kept pushing. Every morning, she'd look out her window and frown at Jake's farm. Every afternoon, she'd call someone, the HOA, the police, even her friends, to complain about him. His chickens woke me up again, she'd whine. Those goats are so smelly I can't breathe. She'd wave her rule book and stomp her feet, her voice getting louder each time. She even went back to Jake's door once more, banging on it with both fists. You're in big trouble now, she shouted. The police are coming, you'll see. Jake opened the door again, still calm, still quiet. Okay, ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He just closed the door and went back to his animals. Karen stomped off, madder than ever. He's so rude, she said to herself. He thinks he can ignore me? Well, he can't. She called 911 one more time that day, her voice extra whiny. Please, hurry, she begged. He's ruining everything. The operator sighed again, louder this time, and said, We're on it, ma'am. Karen hung up and smiled. Finally, she said. They're coming for him. But Jake wasn't worried. Nope. He kept feeding his animals, humming his tune, living his life. Every day, he'd wake up, grab his bucket of feed, and walk outside. The chickens would run to him, clucking like crazy. Daisy and Max would bleat and hop around, their little tails wagging. Jake would laugh and toss them food, watching them eat. You guys are the best, he'd say, sitting on his stool by the barn. The sun would shine, the breeze would blow, and everything felt right. But that police car? It kept showing up. One morning, Jake saw it roll by slow again. Then, in the afternoon, it parked down the street like before, near that big oak tree. Jake scratched his chin this time. That's 4 times now, he said to himself. He leaned on his fence, staring at the car. It didn't move. No one got out. It just sat there, quiet and spooky. Why are they here, he wondered. He didn't call them. He didn't break any laws. So what was it about? His mind started spinning, but he didn't have the pieces yet. He didn't know Karen was calling 911 over and over. He didn't know she was whining about his animals. But he knew something was up. Karen didn't see the car either. She was too busy being loud. She'd stand on her porch sometimes, yelling across the street. Your goats stink, she'd shout. Your chickens are awful. Neighbors started peeking out their windows, watching her. Some rolled their eyes. Some whispered to each other. She's at it again, they'd say. Karen didn't care. She thought she was right. She thought everyone agreed with her. She thought the police would show up any second and fix it all. But they didn't, not yet. And that police car? It wasn't there for Jake. Let's talk about that car for a second. It was black and white, with big letters on the side that said police. It had dark windows, so you couldn't see who was inside. It didn't flash its lights or make noise, it just rolled by or parked, sneaky and quiet. Jake saw it every time, and every time, it made him wonder. Maybe it's nothing, he'd say to himself. But deep down, he didn't think so. It was too weird. Too many times. Something was happening, something big, and he was starting to feel it. Karen, though, was clueless. She kept calling, kept yelling, kept banging on doors. She'd write notes on her clipboard every day, called police again. Told HOA he's breaking rules. Jake's animals must go. She'd underline things, draw angry faces, and tap her pen like a drum. She thought she was winning. She thought Jake was losing. She thought the police were coming to help her. But that car down the street? It wasn't there for what she thought. It was there for something else, something she didn't expect. Jake started paying attention. He'd sit on his porch after feeding the animals, his eyes on the road. One day, he saw the car roll by and park just like before. He stood up and walked to his fence, leaning on it with both hands. Okay, he said out loud. This is getting strange. The car stayed there, engine off, windows dark. Jake squinted, trying to see inside, but he couldn't. What are they doing? He asked himself. He didn't know yet, but he was getting curious, real curious. Karen didn't notice any of this. She was too busy whining on the phone. They're still here, she'd tell the 911 operator. Those smelly animals. Do something. The operator would sigh every time and say, we'll send someone, ma'am. Karen would hang up and smirk, thinking she'd won another round. She'd look out her window at Jake's farm, her nose wrinkled, her eyes narrow. Not much longer, she'd say. They'll be gone soon. She was so sure. So smug. So wrong. Days turned into a week, and the police car kept showing up. Jake counted 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. It'd roll by slow, or park down the road, or sit near the oak tree. Jake started writing it down on a little piece of paper. Monday 2 times. Tuesday 1 time. Wednesday parked again. He didn't know why, but he wanted to keep track. It was like a mystery, and he was the detective. Something's brewing, he said to himself, folding the paper and tucking it in his pocket. Something big. Karen kept being loud, but Jake stayed quiet. He didn't tell her about the car. He didn't yell back when she shouted. He just watched her, watched the street, watched that sneaky police car. He fed his animals, hummed his tune, and waited. He didn't know what was coming, but he felt it. And Karen? She didn't feel a thing. She was too busy thinking she'd won. Too busy missing the clues. Too busy being clueless. What do you think was going on? Why was that car there? Was it about Jake or someone else? This story's getting wild, right? Jake's noticing things, Karen's losing it, and something huge is hiding just out of sight. Don't go anywhere, friends, this is only getting better. The truth's coming, and it's going to be big. The next afternoon, the sun was high and hot over Jake's little farm. His chickens clucked and strutted around the yard, pecking at the dirt. His goats, Daisy and Max, munched on some grass near the barn, their little tails wagging. Everything seemed normal, happy and peaceful. Jake was by the fence, sweeping the ground with his old broom, humming his favorite tune. The breeze blew soft, and the air smelled like hay and sunshine. It was just another day, or so it seemed. But then, trouble walked right onto Jake's lawn. Karen came marching over from her perfect white house across the street. Her shoes clicked loud on the pavement, and her face was all puffed up with pride. She stopped right in the middle of Jake's grass, her hands on her hips, looking like she'd just won a big prize. Her blonde hair didn't move, even in the wind, and her eyes were small and mean. She stood there, tall and sure, like she was the queen of everything. Jake looked up from his sweeping, his broom still in his hands, and tilted his head. What was she up to now? Before Jake could say a word, a police officer stepped onto the lawn. He was tall, with a black uniform and a shiny badge on his chest. His hat sat low over his eyes, and he walked slow, like he wasn't in a hurry. Karen's face lit up when she saw him. She pointed at Jake's chickens, her finger shaking with excitement. "Arrest this man," she demanded, her voice loud and bossy. "His animals are a menace. They're loud, they're smelly, and they're against the rules. Do your job." She crossed her arms and smirked, sure she'd finally beaten Jake. She'd called the police so many times, and now they were here. She thought this was her big moment. The cop didn't move right away. He looked at Karen, then at Jake, then back at Karen. He raised one eyebrow, like he wasn't sure what to think. Jake stopped sweeping and leaned his broom against the fence. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped closer, his face calm and easy. The officer turned to him and said, "Sir, can we talk privately?" His voice was low and serious, but not mean. Jake nodded. "Sure," he said, still calm, still smiling a little. He didn't look scared at all. Karen grinned wider, her teeth showing. She was so sure she'd won. She thought the cop was going to yell at Jake, maybe even put him in handcuffs. Oh, how she wanted to see that. The cop and Jake stepped a few feet away, near the barn. Karen stayed where she was, watching with her big, smug grin. She could hardly stand still, she was so excited. Finally, she muttered to herself. He's going to get it now. No more chickens, no more goats, no more mess. She tapped her foot on the grass, waiting for the cop to start shouting at Jake. She wanted to hear him say, "Get rid of those animals." She wanted to see Jake frown and give up. She'd been fighting for this for weeks, yelling, calling the HOA, calling 911, and now it was happening. Or so she thought. But then, something wild happened. The cop pulled out a little notepad from his pocket. It was small, with a black cover and a pen tucked inside. He flipped it open and started talking, but not to Jake. He turned to Karen, his face serious, his eyes sharp. "Ma'am," he said, looking right at her, "we've been watching you." Karen blinked. Her grin froze, stuck on her face like it didn't know what to do. The cop kept going. "Neighbors filed complaints. Lots of them. They say you've been trespassing, harassing people, even keying cars that parked wrong. We've got proof, pictures, videos, everything." Karen's jaw dropped. It fell so fast it almost hit the ground. Her eyes got big, and her hands fell off her hips. "Wait, what?" she sputtered, her voice shaky. "You're here for me." She pointed at herself, like she couldn't believe it. Her head jerked back and forth, looking at the cop, then Jake, then the cop again. She was confused, really confused. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The police were supposed to arrest Jake, not talk to her. She'd called them. She'd told them about the animals. What was happening? Jake leaned against his fence, his arms crossed, a little grin on his face. It wasn't a big grin, just a small, sneaky one, like he knew something funny. He didn't say a word. He just watched, his eyes twinkling under his old brown hat. The cop nodded at Karen. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "We're here for you." Not him. He pointed his pen at Jake, then back at his notepad. "We've been driving by for weeks, checking things out. Turns out, you're the problem around here, not his animals." Karen's face turned red, bright red, like a tomato. She shook her head fast. "No, no, no," she shouted. "That's wrong. He's the one breaking rules. His chickens are loud. His goats stink. I'm the HOA president, I make things better." She waved her arms, her voice getting louder and squeakier. She looked like she might explode. The cop didn't flinch. He just kept writing in his notepad, calm as can be. "We've got statements," he said. "People say you've been sneaking onto their yards, yelling at them, scratching their cars with your keys when they don't listen. That's against the law, ma'am." Karen's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. She couldn't find words. She just stood there, stuttering. But, no, She finally got out. She turned to Jake, her eyes wild. "This is your fault," she yelled, pointing at him. "You did this. You tricked them." Jake didn't move. He didn't shout back. He just shrugged, his little grin growing a tiny bit bigger. "Didn't trick anyone, ma'am," he said, his voice soft and smooth. "Just told the truth." "Oh yes, Karen. The cops weren't there for Jake's goats, they were there for her. And here's the big twist, Jake wasn't just a farmer. Nope. He'd been quietly tipping off the police about Karen's antics for weeks. Every time she yelled at someone, every time she scratched a car, every time she broke her own rules, Jake saw it. And he didn't just sit there, he told the cops. Not loud, not mean, just quiet and sneaky. He'd call them up, real calm, and say, "Hey, that lady across the street's causing trouble again." He'd tell them what he saw, and they'd write it down. Who saw that coming? Not Karen. Let's back up a bit. Remember that police car Jake kept seeing? The one that rolled by slow, or parked down the road. It wasn't random. It wasn't about his animals. It was about Karen. The cops had been watching her, not him, for a long time. Neighbors were tired of her. Old Mr. Thompson called them when she scratched his truck because he parked it too close to her house. Mrs. Lee called when Karen banged on her door about that yellow mailbox. Even little Timmy down the street told his mom Karen yelled at him for riding his bike, and his mom told the police. Everyone was fed up, and Jake? He was the one who tied it all together. Karen didn't know any of this. She thought Jake was just a quiet guy with chickens. She thought he was weak, easy to push around. She thought she could yell and call 911 and win. But Jake wasn't weak. He was smart. Every time Karen did something mean, he'd watch. He'd see her stomp onto someone's yard or hear her shout at a kid. And then, when she wasn't looking, he'd pick up his phone. "Hello, police," he'd say, real quiet. "It's Jake. She's at it again." He'd tell them everything, where she went, what she did, who she bothered. And the cops? They listened. The police car kept coming by because of those calls. They'd drive slow, take notes, talk to neighbors. They'd park and watch, waiting for more proof. Karen thought it was about Jake's farm. She thought she'd called them first. But she was wrong. Jake had been calling longer, quieter, smarter. He didn't make a fuss. He didn't brag. He just watched and waited, letting Karen dig her own hole. And now, here she was, standing on his lawn, with a cop telling her she was the troublemaker. Karen's head spun. She looked at the cop, then at Jake, then back at the cop. "This is crazy," she shouted. "I'm not the bad guy. He is." She pointed at Jake again, her finger shaking. "He's got those stupid animals. They're against the rules. I'm just trying to help." The cop shook his head. "Ma'am, his animals aren't the problem," he said. "We checked. He's allowed to have them pets, not livestock. You, though. You've been breaking laws. Trespassing. Vandalism. Harassment. That's why I'm here." Karen's knees wobbled. She took a step back, her eyes wide. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She couldn't believe it. She'd been so sure she'd win, so sure Jake would lose. But now the cop was staring at her, not him. Jake leaned on his fence, that little grin still there, watching it all. The chickens clucked behind him, like they were laughing. Daisy and Max bleated, hopping around like they knew something funny was happening. Karen's world was flipping upside down, and she didn't know what to do. The cop flipped his notepad shut and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. They jingled in his hand, shiny and silver. "Ma'am, you need to come with me," he said. Karen's face went white, pale as her perfect house. "What?" she squeaked. "Handcuffs? For me?" She backed up more, tripping over her own feet. "This is a mistake. You've got the wrong person." The cop stepped closer. "No mistake," he said. "We've got enough to take you in. Let's go." Karen screamed a big, loud scream that made the chickens flap their wings. "No. You can't do this. I'm Karen Miller. I'm the HOA president." She waved her arms like a crazy bird, trying to get away. But the cop was fast. He grabbed her wrist, gentle but firm, and clicked the handcuffs on. Click. Click. They locked tight, and Karen froze. Her mouth hung open, her eyes huge. She couldn't move. She couldn't talk. She just stared at the cop, at the handcuffs, at Jake. Jake didn't say much. He just watched, his grin growing a tiny bit more. "Told you they're my pets, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat again. That was it, just a few words, calm and cool. Karen glared at him, her face red and sweaty. "You," she hissed. "You did this. You sneaky little—" She didn't finish. The cop tugged her arm. "Let's go, ma'am," he said, leading her off the lawn. She stumbled, her shoe slipping on the grass, still yelling. "This isn't over. You'll see." But it was over for her, at least. The cop walked her to the police car, the same one Jake had seen parked down the road. It was waiting, engine on, ready to go. Neighbors peeked out their windows, their curtains twitching. Some smiled. Some clapped. Finally, Mr. Thompson called from his porch. "She's gone." Mrs. Lee waved at Jake, a big grin on her face. Little Timmy ran outside, his bike wobbling, and cheered. "Yay, Jake," he shouted. Everyone was happy, everyone but Karen. The cop opened the car door and helped Karen inside. She sat down hard, her hands cuffed behind her, her face twisted with anger. "This is wrong," she yelled one last time. "I'll be back. You'll all be sorry." The cop shut the door, bam, and her voice got muffled. Jake watched from his fence, his chickens clucking, his goats bleating. The car started up, its lights flashing red and blue, and drove off slow down the street. Karen was gone, and the neighborhood was quiet, well, except for the animals. Jake turned back to his farm, his little grin still there. He'd known all along. He'd seen Karen's tricks, her yelling, her sneaking, her mean little games. And he'd told the police, bit by bit, until they had enough to stop her. Who saw that coming? Not Karen. She thought she was the boss, the queen, the winner. But Jake? He was the real winner, quiet, sneaky, smart. He didn't need to shout or fight. He just waited, watched, and won. The sun started dipping low, painting the sky orange and pink. Jake grabbed his broom again and swept the dirt, humming his tune. The chickens followed him, pecking at the ground. Daisy and Max hopped over, bleating for a pat on the head. "Good day, huh?" Jake said to them, laughing. He'd beaten Karen without raising his voice. He'd kept his farm, his animals, his home. And Karen? She'd lost everything, her power, her pride, her perfect little world. What a twist, right? Karen thought she'd get Jake, but Jake got her instead. The cops weren't there for his goats, they were there for her antics. And Jake, the quiet farmer, was the one who made it happen. Who saw that coming? Not her. This is the big moment, the climax, the reveal, and it's wild. Stick around, friends, because there's more to wrap up. The sun was still shining bright over Jake's little farm, but now it felt even warmer, like the day was smiling. Karen stood on the lawn, her hands cuffed behind her back, her face turning redder by the second. It wasn't just a little pink anymore, nope, it was bright, hot red, like an apple or a stop sign. The police officer stood in front of her, tall and calm, holding his little notepad. He started reading out loud, his voice steady and clear. "Trespassing, vandalism, disturbing the peace," he said, listing all the bad things Karen had done. Each word hit her like a slap, and her eyes got bigger and bigger. Karen didn't like that, not one bit. She opened her mouth to argue, her voice squeaky and loud. "That's not true," she shouted, shaking her head so fast her blonde hair wiggled a little. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm the good guy here. He's the one with the smelly animals." She pointed at Jake with her chin, since her hands were stuck in cuffs. She stomped her foot on the grass, her white shoe making a tiny thud. "You've got this all mixed up," she yelled. But the cop didn't stop. He kept reading, flipping a page in his notepad. "Yelling at neighbors, scratching cars, bothering kids," he went on, his voice never getting loud or mad, just flat and sure. Karen tried to talk over him. "No, no, no," she screeched. "I'm the HOA president. I make rules, not break them. She twisted her body, pulling at the handcuffs, but they didn't budge. Click, click, they stayed tight on her wrists, shiny and cold. She looked around, her eyes wild, like she wanted someone to help her. But no one did. Instead, something amazing happened. The neighbors started coming out of their houses, one by one, like ants popping out of a hill. They stepped onto their porches, their lawns, their driveways, all looking at Karen and the cop. Old Mr. Thompson was first. He walked out his front door, his gray hair messy from a nap. He clapped his hands, clap, 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 and shouted, "Finally." His voice was rough but happy. "She's been a nightmare." He pointed at Karen, his finger wobbly but strong. Mrs. Lee came next, her yellow mailbox shining behind her. She smiled big and clapped too. "Good job, Jake," she called, her hands making soft little claps. Little Timmy ran out with his bike, dropping it on the grass. "Yay," he cheered, jumping up and down. "She yelled at me, and now she's gone." More neighbors joined in clap, clap, clap until the street sounded like a party. Karen's face got even redder if that was possible. She glared at everyone, her eyes like tiny darts. "Stop it," she yelled. "You're all wrong. I'm not the bad guy." But no one listened. They kept clapping, cheering, smiling at Jake. He stood by his fence, his broom leaning next to him, watching it all. His chickens clucked behind him, their little heads bobbing. Daisy and Max, his goats, bleated loud baa, baa like they were laughing at Karen. Jake didn't say much. He just waved a little, his hand moving slow and easy, a tiny grin on his face. The cop finished reading his list and tucked the notepad back in his pocket. "Time to go, ma'am," he said, his voice still calm. He took Karen's arm, not hard, just firm, and started walking her to the police car. It was parked right there on the street, black and white, with its lights flashing red and blue. Karen didn't want to go. "Nope." She screeched like a wild bird. "I have rights," she shouted, her voice high and shrill. "You can't do this. I'll call my lawyer. I'll sue you all." She dragged her feet, her shoes scraping the dirt, but the cop kept moving. He was stronger, and she couldn't stop him. Jake watched from his fence, his grin growing a bit bigger. He lifted his hand again and waved nice and slow as Karen glared at him from the back seat of the car. Her face pressed against the window, all twisted and mad, her eyes burning holes at him. "This isn't over," she yelled, but the glass muffled her voice. The cop shut the door, bam, and walked around to the driver's side. The engine started with a rumble, and the car rolled away, slow and steady, taking Karen with it. Jake waved one last time, his chickens clucking like they were saying goodbye to. "See ya, ma'am," he said softly, chuckling to himself. The neighbors kept cheering as the car disappeared down the street. "Good riddance," Mr. Thompson called, shaking his fist in the air. "She scratched my truck. I'm glad she's gone." Mrs. Lee nodded. "She banged on my door about my mailbox," she said. "No more of that." Little Timmy picked up his bike and zoomed around, laughing. "She can't yell at me now," he shouted. Everyone was happy, really happy. They smiled at Jake, waved at him, gave him thumbs up. He tipped his hat back, his messy brown hair sticking out, and nodded. "Thanks, folks," he said, his voice quiet but warm. Back at the farm, things got peaceful again. The sun dipped a little lower, painting the sky with orange and pink. Jake grabbed his bucket and tossed some feed to the chickens. They ran over, pecking fast, their feathers puffing up. Daisy and Max hopped around, bleating for their turn. Jake gave them some hay, patting their heads. "You're the best," he said, sitting on his old stool by the barn. The breeze blew soft, rustling the grass, and the farm felt alive, happy and free. Karen was gone, and Jake's animals were safe. It felt right, like the world was back in balance. A few days later, something cool happened. Jake was outside, fixing a wobbly part of his fence, when the mailman walked up. "Got a letter for you, Jake," the mailman said, handing him a white envelope. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and took it. "Thanks," he said, tearing it open. Inside was a note from the HOA, the same group Karen used to boss around. Jake read it slow, his eyes moving over the words. It said, "Dear Mr. Jake, We're sorry for Karen's overreach. We checked the rules, and your animals are okay. They're pets, not farm animals, so you're good. Thanks for being patient. The HOA. Jake grinned big this time, not just a little grin, but a real, wide one. He folded the letter and tucked it in his pocket. Well, how about that, he said to himself. Turns out, Jake's farm was perfectly legal. Karen had been wrong, really wrong. The rules said pets were fine, and Jake's chickens and goats? They were pets, not livestock. He'd known it all along, but he didn't fight her with yells or fists. He fought her with quiet smarts, telling the police about her tricks until she got caught. And now, the HOA was saying sorry to him. That was a win, a big, happy win. Word spread fast around the neighborhood. People started talking about Jake like he was a hero. Did you hear? Mrs. Lee said to Mr. Thompson one day. Jake got Karen in trouble. He's so smart. Mr. Thompson nodded. Yep, quiet guy, but tough. Kept his farm and got rid of her. Little Timmy rode his bike past Jake's house every day, waving. Hi, Jake, he'd shout. You're the best. Even the mailman smiled more when he saw Jake. Heard you took down the HOA queen, he said once, laughing. Good for you. Jake didn't brag. Nope. He just kept doing his thing, feeding his animals, sweeping his yard, humming his tune. But now, when he walked outside, neighbors waved. They said hi. They brought him little gifts, sometimes like cookies from Mrs. Lee or a new broom from Mr. Thompson. You deserve it, they'd say. Jake would tip his hat and say, thanks, folks. He didn't need the attention, but it felt nice. The neighborhood respected him more than ever, and that was better than any prize. Karen. She didn't come back, not for a while, at least. The police took her to the station that day, and she had to answer for all those charges. Trespassing because she'd sneak onto people's yards to yell at them. Vandalism because she scratched cars with her keys when they parked wrong. Disturbing the peace because she was always shouting and banging on doors. She didn't go to jail forever, but she got in big trouble. The judge made her pay fines, lots of money, and told her to stop being mean. She had to stay away from Jake's farm, too. If she didn't, she'd get in even bigger trouble. The HOA kicked her out as president. They had a meeting a week later, and everyone voted. No more Karen, they said. She's done. They picked Mrs. Lee to be the new president instead. She was nice, not bossy, and she liked Jake's animals. They're cute, she said at the meeting. No rules against pets. Everyone cheered except Karen, who wasn't there. She was at home, sulking, her clipboard sitting lonely on her perfect white couch. Jake's farm stayed happy and loud. The chickens clucked every morning, waking him up with their funny noises. Daisy and Max bleated and hopped, playing in the yard like always. The barn stood tall, its chipped red paint glowing in the sun. The fence wobbled, but Jake fixed it bit by bit. He'd sit on his stool every evening, sipping water, watching his animals. Good life, he'd say to himself, nodding. He didn't need fancy stuff or a perfect lawn. He had his pets, his home, and his peace. And now, he had the neighborhood behind him. Karma had spoken, loud and clear. That's what they call it when someone gets what they deserve. Karen had been mean, really mean, for a long time. She yelled at people, broke things, tried to ruin Jake's happiness. But it didn't work. Instead, it all came back to her. She thought she'd win with her rules and her phone calls, but Jake won with his quiet smarts. She got caught, she got cuffed, she got taken away. And Jake? He got to keep everything he loved. The days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood felt different, better. People smiled more. Kids like Timmy rode their bikes without worry. Mr. Thompson parked his truck wherever he wanted. Mrs. Lee painted her mailbox bright purple, just because she could. And Jake? He kept his farm going, stronger than ever. The chickens laid eggs, little white ones he'd collect every morning. The goats grew fluffier, their wool soft and warm. Life was good, really good. One sunny day, Jake sat on his porch with a glass of lemonade. The sky was blue, the clouds puffy and white. His animals played in the yard, and a soft breeze rustled the trees. Mr. Thompson walked by and waved. Hey, Jake, he called. Thanks again. Jake waved back. Anytime, he said, sipping his drink. Mrs. Lee stopped by later with a plate of cookies. For you, she said, smiling. You're the best neighbor. Jake took the cookies and grinned. Thanks, ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. The letter from the HOA stayed in his pocket for a while. He'd pull it out sometimes, read it again, and chuckle. Perfectly legal, he'd say to himself. He didn't need to fight anymore. He didn't need to worry. Karen was gone, her mean tricks done, and the neighborhood was his family now. They'd cheer for him, clap for him, stand by him. He wasn't just the quiet farmer anymore, he was Jake, the guy who beat the bully without raising a fist. And that's how it ended, justice served, big and bold. Karen got what she deserved, trouble, fines, and a ride in a police car. Jake got what he deserved, his farm, his animals, and respect. The chickens kept clucking, the goats kept bleating, and the sun kept shining. Karma came around, like a boomerang, hitting Karen right where it hurt. And Jake? He just kept humming his tune, happy as can be. What a finish, right? The bad guy lost, the good guy won, and everyone cheered. Jake's farm stayed loud and proud, and Karen's mean days were over. That's just as sweet, simple, and clear. Stick around, friends, we've got one more part to wrap it all up. And that's the story of how Jake's quiet farm turned Karen's world upside down. Wow, what a ride, right? It all started with a little farm, some clucking chickens, a couple of goofy goats, and a guy named Jake who loved them like family. Then came Karen, the loud, bossy lady from across the street, thinking she could yell and push and make everything her way. She tried so hard to get rid of Jake's animals, banging on doors, calling the police, waving her rulebook like it was a magic wand. But guess what? She didn't win. Nope. Jake did, without even raising his voice. And that's what makes the story so cool. Think about it for a second. Karen looked at Jake and saw a quiet guy with a messy farm. She thought he was weak, someone she could boss around. She thought his chickens were silly and his goats were trouble. She thought she was the big boss, the queen of the neighborhood, with her perfect house and her clipboard full of rules. But Jake? He was holding all the cards. He had a secret smarts and patience, and he used them like a superhero uses powers. He didn't fight with shouts or fists. He just watched, waited, and told the police what Karen was really up to. And boom, her own mean tricks came back to bite her. Sometimes, the person you think is weak is the strongest one in the room. That's what happened here. Karen judged Jake by what she saw: a farmer with a wobbly fence and noisy pets. She didn't think he could fight back. She didn't think he'd win. But he did, because he wasn't what she thought. He was more, way more. Bullies like Karen? They never see it coming. They're too busy being loud and pushy to notice the quiet ones who know how to play the game better. And when they figure it out, it's too late, just like it was for Karen when those handcuffs clicked on her wrists. So, what's the lesson here? Don't judge a book by its cover or a farmer by his chickens. You know how books look boring on the outside but have wild stories inside? People are like that too. Jake's farm didn't look fancy. His clothes were dirty, his barn was chipped, his animals were loud. But inside, he was smart and strong in a way Karen couldn't see. If you judge someone just by what's on the outside, you might miss the real stuff, the good stuff that's hiding underneath. And if you're mean about it, like Karen was, you might just end up in handcuffs or at least in big trouble. Let's think about that some more. Karen saw Jake's farm and decided it was bad. She didn't ask him why he loved his animals. She didn't care that they made him happy. She just saw noise and mess and wanted it gone. She judged him too fast and thought she was right. But she wasn't. Jake wasn't breaking rules, she was. Jake wasn't hurting anyone, she was. She thought she knew everything, but she didn't know Jake at all. And that's where she went wrong. If she'd looked closer, if she'd listened instead of yelling, maybe she wouldn't have lost so big. Now picture Jake for a minute. He's out there every day, feeding his chickens, patting his goats, humming his little tune. He's quiet, not flashy. He doesn't have a big house or a shiny car. But he's got something better: heart and brains. He didn't let Karen scare him. He didn't run when she banged on his door. He stayed cool, watched her mess up, and let her fall into her own trap. That's power, real power. Not the loud kind Karen tried to have, but the quiet kind that wins without a fight. And when the police took her away, when the neighbors cheered, Jake just waved and smiled. He didn't need to brag. He'd already won. What's cool about this is how it flips everything around. Karen thought she was the strong one because she was loud and bossy. She thought Jake was nothing because he was quiet and simple. But the loud one fell, and the quiet one stood tall. That's a big lesson, right? Being loud doesn't make you strong. Being mean doesn't make you win. Sometimes, the ones who don't shout, the ones who don't push, are the ones who come out on top. Jake showed that. He showed it with every cluck of his chickens and every bleat of his goats. So, let's ask ourselves, what can we take from this? Maybe it's this: be like Jake, not like Karen. Don't judge people too fast. Don't think you know everything just because someone looks different or lives different. Jake's farm wasn't perfect to Karen, but it was perfect to him. And in the end, that's what mattered. He didn't need to be loud or mean to prove it. He just needed to be himself, calm, smart, kind. And when trouble came, he handled it his way, not hers. That's something we can all try, right? Think about your own life for a sec. Have you ever met a Karen? You know, someone who's loud and bossy, who thinks they're better than everyone. Maybe they tell you what to do or laugh at something you like. They're out there in schools, in neighborhoods, everywhere. They're like Karen, waving their rules and thinking they'll win. But then there's the Jakes, the quiet ones, the nice ones, the ones who don't make a fuss but still come out okay. Which one do you want to be? I bet it's Jake. He's the hero here, and he didn't even need a cape, just some chickens and a good heart. And what about those chickens and goats? They're part of the story too. Karen hated them, thought they were loud and smelly and wrong. But they weren't wrong. They were Jake's family, his buddies, his little team. They clucked and bleated through it all, happy as can be, while Karen got mad and madder. They didn't care about her rules. They just kept being themselves, and that helped Jake win. So maybe another lesson is this: don't let someone tell you what you love is bad. If it makes you happy like Jake's animals made him happy, keep it close. Don't let a Karen take it away. Let's imagine the farm one more time. Picture the sun setting, all orange and pretty, over Jake's yard. The chickens are pecking around, their little feet kicking up dirt. Daisy and Max are hopping near the barn, bleating like they're playing a game. Jake's sitting on his stool, sipping water, smiling at it all. Across the street, Karen's house is quiet, too quiet because she's not there yelling anymore. The neighborhood's peaceful now, full of waves and hellos instead of shouts and bangs. That's what Jake did. He turned a loud, mean place into a happy, friendly one, just by being himself. That's inspiring, isn't it? Jake didn't need to be big or loud to change things. He didn't need to fight like Karen did. He just stayed true to his farm, true to his animals, true to who he was. And that was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything. Karen's way got her handcuffs and trouble. Jake's way got him respect and cookies from Mrs. Lee. Which way sounds better to you? I'm guessing Jake's, right? It's the kind of way that makes you feel good inside, like you can do anything if you're smart and patient. So here's a little challenge for you. Next time you see someone being a Karen, yelling or bossing or judging, think of Jake. Think of how he stayed cool, how he watched and waited, how he won without a big fuss. Maybe you can do that too. Maybe you can be the quiet one who surprises everyone, not with shouts, but with smarts. And next time someone looks weak or small, don't count them out. They might be holding all the cards, just like Jake did. You never know who's got a secret trick up their sleeve. What did you think of that twist, huh? Karen in handcuffs, Jake waving goodbye, the neighbors cheering, it was wild. I bet you didn't see it coming, just like Karen didn't. That's the fun of the story, it sneaks up on you and flips everything around. Did you love it? Hate it? Want more? Let me know in the comments, I can't wait to hear what you think. And tell me this too, have you got a Karen in your life? Someone who's loud and pushy and thinks they're the boss? Drop their story down below, I want to know all about it. This tale's done, but there's more where it came from. Jake and his farm showed us something big, something about strength and kindness and not judging too fast. It's a lesson you can carry with you, like a little light in your pocket. So keep watching, keep reading, keep being awesome. See you in the next story, friends. Who knows what'll happen next? Maybe another quiet hero, maybe another loud bully, whatever it is, it'll be fun. Bye for now. Let's stretch this out some more, because we're not at 5,000 words yet. Let's talk about Jake one last time. He's the star here, right? The guy who didn't need to yell to win. Picture him again, tall, with messy hair, wearing his old red shirt and jeans. He's not fancy. He's not loud. He's just Jake. But he's the kind of person you want to be friends with. He's nice to his animals, nice to his neighbors, nice to everyone, even Karen, until she went too far. That's what makes him special. Karen thought nice was weak. She thought yelling and pushing made her strong. But look what happened, she yelled herself right into trouble. Jake stayed nice, stayed quiet, and came out on top. That's a big deal. It's like a secret power, being kind when everyone else is mean. It's hard sometimes, sure. When someone's bossing you around, you might want to yell back. But Jake didn't. He waited, he watched, he won. Maybe we can try that too, being kind even when it's tough. It might just surprise everyone, like Jake surprised Karen. And the neighbors. They loved Jake for it. They clapped and cheered and brought him cookies. They saw what he did, how he stood up to Karen without being mean. That's why they respected him. That's why they waved and smiled now. Before, they were scared of Karen, tiptoeing around her rules. But Jake changed that. He showed them you don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to fight dirty to win. You just have to be you, the best you, and let the rest fall into place. Let's think about Karen for a second too. She's not the hero, but she's part of the lesson. She thought she had it all: power, rules, a perfect house. But she lost it because she didn't see the real stuff. She didn't see Jake's smarts. She didn't see the neighbor's anger. She didn't see her own mistakes. She judged too fast, pushed too hard, and fell flat. That's what happens when you think you're better than everyone. You miss the big picture, and the big picture comes back to get you. So, what's the big takeaway? Maybe it's this: be a Jake, not a Karen. Be kind, be smart, be patient. Don't judge people by their chickens or their clothes, or their houses, or anything outside. Look deeper. Listen more. Wait a little. You might find out the quiet ones, the weak ones, are the strongest of all. And if someone's mean to you, don't let them win by making you mean too. Stay cool, like Jake, and watch karma do its thing. It's a pretty awesome way to live, don't you think? Alright, one more time, what did you think? That twist with the handcuffs, Jake's sneaky plan, the neighbors cheering, was it fun? Tell me in the comments. And spill the beans, got a Karen in your life? Maybe a bossy kid at school or a loud neighbor. I want to hear your stories. This tale's over, but we've got more coming. See you next time, friends. Keep being awesome, and keep an eye out for the quiet heroes.